Hello. What is reason? Now, this is a very interesting concept because there's a lot of different definitions for what reason is. But I'm going to give you two right now. One of them is a statement provided to make a past action understandable or to validate a belief. Basically, a justification. Option two, the intellectual power of the human mind to comprehend, deduce, and distinguish truth from falsehood. So, throughout philosophical history, this second definition was used a lot, right? Using reason to get to truth. But in recent years, we have started to develop the first definition, using it as a justification a lot more. And this idea actually came from David Hume himself. And he says, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. Basically, what he means by this is that we use reason as a way of justifying our passions. And so today we are going to talk about that. And we are going to talk about how reason or justification has been used as a way of justifying certain systems or ideologies. So, the first thing we're going to talk about today is the justification by God. And this is important because we need to understand the justification by God before we jump into the justification by science, which came later. So, the first thing we're going to talk about today is the doctrine of discovery. And if you don't know what the doctrine of discovery is, it is basically the document supporting Spain's strategy to ensure its exclusive right to the lands discovered by Christopher Columbus the previous year. Basically, this document is a way of justifying colonialism, right? It's a way of justifying taking land from the indigenous people. And I want to point to a specific passage in here that talks about this. Kings of illustrious memory, to subject said mainlands and islands and their local population and inhabitants with the help of divine grace and to bring them back to the Catholic faith. So, this doctrine is basically saying, hey, take those lands, convert the people there, and that way they can at least be saved by the Catholic faith. Of course, the last example that we're going to use is Manifest Destiny, right? When America believed that the land that they took was preordained by God. Manifest Destiny was not simply a cloak for American imperialism and justification for America's territorial ambitions. It was also firmly anchored in a long-standing and deep sense of special and unique American destiny. The belief that, in the words of historian Comrade Cherry, American is a nation called to a specific destiny by God. So you can see here, again, the theme of justification by God, right? God has ordained us to have this land, and so therefore we shall take it. Now, the last example we're going to talk about today that is going to feed into our scientific justification is the creation of race. Now, one thing you need to understand is that race is a new concept, at least in the way that we have institutionalized it. We have never had a specific category for race. It was created because of a justification for whiteness. Southern planters who were in regular communication with these island communities brought in a large number of Africans during the 18th century and systematically developed their slave practices and laws. Christianity provided an early rationalization for permanent enslavement. Africans were heathens and enslaved in their own lands. Under English enslavement, their souls would be saved. A few intellectuals revived an older image of all living things, the scale of nature or great chain of being, to demonstrate that nature or God have made men unequal. Racial stereotyping of Africa was magnified by the Haitian Rebellion of 1791. This heightened the American feel of revolt and retaliation by enslaved people, causing greater restrictions and even harsher and more degrading treatment. Grotesque descriptions of the low-status races, Black and Indigenous people, were widely publicized, and they helped foster fear and loathing. So, as you can see from these passages, racism didn't just start from a single concept, right? It's evolving. So you start with something like slavery, and you start thinking, okay, well, I should be superior to these types of people because of something like the Great Chain of Being. Again, this justification by God that we are better than these other groups of people. And that is what's going to cause racism to be more and more institutionalized as you grow your society. So, in summary, these few points are being made in a way of trying to create a justification for things like racism and colonialism, but it's a justification by God. God ordained us to take their land. God ordained these people to be unequal. This is a justification by God. So, the second thing we're going to talk about is the justification by science. And I think this is more important, even though it feeds off of this justification by God, right? As we move throughout the Enlightenment period and scientific revolution, you're going to see science become the main component of your worldview. Now, this starts with On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. I'm not going to sit here and say Charles Darwin did a bad thing by creating evolutionary science, but what you're going to see is a way of people using this information to justify a worldview. So, Charles Darwin creates the idea of natural selection. What is natural selection? Natural selection is the evolutionary process where organisms that are better adapted to their environment tend to survive, reproduce, and pass on their advantageous genetic traits. So, this is an important concept, the concept of adaptation. The fact that if I adapt to that environment, I am more likely to pass on my genes that are better suited for that environment. But what you're going to see is that people will take this argument to justify a system or an ideology, right? Mainly someone like Herbert Spencer, who creates the idea of social Darwinism. Spencer incorporated the themes of biological evolution and social progress into a grand universal scheme. Attending Darwin, he introduced the idea of competition, the struggle for existence, and the survival of the fittest. His fittest were the socially and economically most successful, not only among the groups, but within societies. The savage or inferior races of men were clearly unfit and would soon die out. For this reason, Spencer advocated that governments reject policies that help the poor. He was against all charities, child labor laws, women's rights, and education for the poor and uncivilized. Such actions, he claimed, interfered with the laws of natural evolution. These beliefs became known as social Darwinism. The idea is that these people, women's rights, child labor laws, whatever, the poor, these people are inferior and are only holding our society back. And remember, this is only possible because of Charles Darwin's natural selection. That term, survival of the fittest, didn't come from Charles Darwin. It came from Herbert Spencer, and it's being used as a way to justify colonization and inferior or savage people. And now, with the perspective of Herbert Spencer, what you're going to do is get a bunch of scientific racism, which is basically justifying racism by science. Samuel Morton collected skulls from around the world and developed techniques for measuring them. He thought he could identify racial differences between these skulls. After developing techniques for measuring the internal capacity of the skull, he concluded that black Africans had smaller brains than white Europeans, with indigenous brains intermediate between the two. Because brain size had long been correlated with intelligence in both the popular mind and science, Morton's findings seemed to confirm that black individuals were also less intelligent than white ones. Even in this person alone, you can see that there is a justification of science there. And because science is supposed to be more quote unquote objective, it is being more institutionalized into your system. Using anthropometric techniques, they produce massive tables of quantity measurements of the body dimensions of tens of thousands of whites, blacks, mulattoes, and Indians. Scientists interpret the data in a way that strengthened the argument that races were fundamentally distinct and that confirmed that blacks, Indians, and mulattoes were inferior to whites. By the 1960s and 70s, scientists were writing about racial groups as populations that differed from one another, not in absolute features, but in frequencies of expressions of genes that all populations share. It was expected that each race and each population within a race would have frequencies of certain ascertainable genes that would mark them off from other races. The internal variations within races have proved to be greater than those between races. More importantly, physical and phenotypic features assumed to be determined by DNA are inherited independently of one another, further frustrating attempts to describe race differences in genetic terms. So you can see how scientists are trying to justify a worldview in order to support their theory that white people are superior to any other people. And this is funny because they're frustrated at the idea that it's not true. This is what I mean by justification. Science is being used as a justification for this idea that white people are superior to black people. And again, because science is supposed to be objective, even though the objectivity is defined by something they're trying to find rather than something that is creating absolute truth, that is being institutionalized into your system as well. Something I want to point out as well is that these concepts aren't super far from today. On the Origin of Species was only made in 1860s. This is right when the Civil War was happening, and the idea of scientific racism was still being developed throughout this time. 1900s, that's only 125 years ago. So if someone tells you that we don't live in this sort of world today, it's wrong. As I just read in one of the papers, scientific racism was still being justified in the 1960s and 70s. So please don't think that these concepts are super far, because they're not. We still live in what a lot of these concepts are today. So, in terms of today, let's think about it. What are we today justifying? Let's think about the biggest issues that affect our country, or if you live in America, our country today. Whether or not you fall on both sides of the spectrum, how is this information being sold to you? Is it trying to justify a narrative? I think this is something that's really important to consider, because we live in a world where anything can be justified. I just showed you ample evidence about how colonialism and racism were justified using science, which is supposed to be more quote unquote objective. So I think it's really important in today's world that we understand who is providing this information for us and what is the intent of them providing this information to us. All right, that's the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Leave a comment below if you think my ideas are right, if you think my logic follows through, and I'll see you next time.